30 years, he said, his voice sharp and cold, and you still think you matter. That was the last sentence that carved its way into my chest before silence replaced fatherhood. Decades of being ignored, cast aside, treated as though my love and sacrifices meant nothing. Betrayal doesn't always come in sudden storms. It comes in long winters of absence, in phone calls that never arrive, in holidays spent alone while your child pretends you no longer exist. And when the years pass, the wound does not heal. It hardens, becoming a scar that whispers every time you remember who should have stood by your side, but didn't. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I've lived in Portland, Oregon for most of my life, long enough to see the city stretch upward with glass towers and outward with endless rows of new condos. But my world never changed much. My house is an old Craftsman on the east side, its wood floors creaking like tired knees, its pipes groaning in winter. The paint is chipped on the porch railing, and the garage smells faintly of motor oil no matter how many times I scrub the floor. For 30 years, this house has been my only constant, while the rest of my life shifted and frayed around the edges. My name is Thomas Green. I'm 72 years old and retired, though retirement feels less like freedom and more like waiting. I once owned a small auto shop near the Willamette River, a place where grease settled deep into my fingernails and time passed to the rhythm of wrenches clanking against steel. That shop kept food on the table and a roof over our heads, but it also took me away from my family. When my wife, Margaret, passed from cancer, I was left to raise our son, Daniel, on my own. He was 15 then, stubborn and smart, with eyes that always seemed to be measuring me. I tried my best. I pushed him toward responsibility, lectured him about hard work, and reminded him daily that nothing in this world was free. But Daniel saw those words as shackles instead of guidance. By the time he went to college, our talks had hardened into arguments. The last fight we had was in the middle of my shop, oil stains between us, his voice rising as mine did the same. He shouted that he'd never be like me, and I told him if he walked out that door, he shouldn't bother coming back. He left, and he never came back. For 30 years, silence became the language between us. No phone calls, no letters, not even a Christmas card. At first, it felt like an open wound, sharp and raw, but over time, it became a scar. I buried myself in work until arthritis made it impossible. Then I settled into quiet routines, morning walks to the corner cafe, afternoons tinkering in my garage with old carburetors, evenings with a book by the fire. Friends grew fewer with each year, neighbors changed, and I became known as the old man who shoveled his own sidewalk, even in freezing rain. It might have stayed that way forever, except life has a way of surprising you when you've stopped expecting it. A few years ago, a neighbor suggested I attend a community meeting about a redevelopment project near the waterfront. I had some savings from selling my shop, nothing extraordinary, but enough to invest. At first, it seemed like a small gamble, one I didn't talk about. Then the project doubled in value, then tripled. By the time I turned 70, my modest buy-in had grown into millions. I went from counting every medical bill to having bankers call me Mr. Green with a new respect in their voices. I didn't flaunt it. I kept driving my rusty pickup. I wore the same flannel shirts. To anyone passing on the street, I was just another retiree tending his yard. But behind my quiet front door, I carried the knowledge that I was a wealthy man now. Not wealthy like the tech millionaires flashing their Teslas around town, but wealthy enough that I no longer had to worry about running out of money before I ran out of years. Then, one cold December afternoon, the phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail. I usually do, but something made me glance at the caller ID. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Daniel Green, my son, the boy I hadn't spoken to in 3 decades. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. For a moment, all I heard was his breathing, heavier now, older, but unmistakable. "Dad," he said. Just that one word, and it dragged up 30 years of silence like an anchor pulled from the riverbed. His voice carried an edge of strain, maybe even desperation. Then came the words I never thought I'd hear. "I was wondering if you'd like to come to Christmas dinner this year." I stood frozen in my kitchen, the winter light slanting through the window, dust floating in the still air. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft and silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. 30 years gone, and suddenly an invitation, spoken as if no time had passed at all. I didn't answer right away. My heart beat hard, my mind chasing questions. Why now? Why after all these years? But one thing was certain. The quiet life I had grown used to was about to be shattered. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to point number 2. The days after Daniel's call unfolded in a kind of quiet haze. I tried to convince myself that it was just a simple invitation, nothing more. But the truth is, it kept gnawing at me. 30 years of silence doesn't dissolve with one phone call. The weight of those decades pressed against my ribs every time I replayed his voice in my head. That carefully measured tone, polite but strangely hollow. It wasn't the sound of a son aching to reconnect with his father. It was the sound of a man trying to keep his words straight. I busied myself with small chores to avoid thinking too hard. I salted the front steps when the snow thickened, checked the furnace filter in the basement, and even pulled the old carburetor project out of its box in the garage. My fingers trembled as I handled the parts, arthritis making every twist of the wrench a reminder of years gone by. Still, tinkering gave me something to hold on to, a distraction from the unease gathering like storm clouds in my mind. But the distractions never lasted long. Every time I paused, my thoughts circled back to the same question. Why now? Why, after 30 years of silence, after 30 Christmases without even a postcard, would Daniel suddenly reach out? The easiest answer was the one I least wanted to believe. He had heard about the money. My neighbor had mentioned once that word travels fast in these parts, and I'd started to notice it myself. The mailbox had become an unlikely messenger of my new status. Glossy flyers for luxury condos found their way in, promising rooftop pools and skyline views. Brochures from financial advisors I'd never spoken to stacked up, each one addressed personally to me with embossed lettering. I hadn't told anyone about my investments, yet somehow my name had slipped into the circles of people who could afford more than they needed. And if neighbors or strangers had caught wind of it, it was only a matter of time before Daniel had too. That Sunday at church, I sat in my usual back pew, hands folded tight, trying to focus on the sermon. But every verse washed past me without sinking in. Instead, I found myself imagining Daniel's life as it might look now. Did he have a house in the suburbs? A wife who kept the mantle decorated for Christmas? Children I had never met? Grandchildren whose names I didn't even know? With every picture I drew in my mind, suspicion crept in. If he had built a family, why invite me now? If he was doing well, why disturb the silence we had both maintained for so long? That night, unable to sleep, I pulled an old shoebox out from under my bed. Inside were the letters I had written to Daniel over the years, but never mailed. Some were written on his birthdays, others on Christmas Eve, and a few during quiet evenings when loneliness overpowered my pride. The words were uneven, scratched in ballpoint pen, filled with things I wanted to tell him, memories, apologies, advice. Reading them again, I felt both regret and anger. Regret for the boy I had failed to reach. Anger at the man who had let decades pass without a word. I sat at the kitchen table with those letters spread out before me, the snow outside falling heavier against the window. The silence in the house was thick, like it was waiting for me to admit what I already knew. If Daniel's sudden invitation was just about family, he would have called years earlier. No, this was something else. A hook dressed up as kindness, and I couldn't afford to be naive about it. I thought back to the years running my shop, the customers who tried to shortchange me, the vendors who padded their invoices, the times when a man's handshake wasn't worth the grease on his palm. Those lessons had hardened me, taught me to always check the numbers, never to take a story at face value. Now, those instincts stirred again. Daniel had opened a door, but behind it was a story he wasn't ready to tell. My job was to find out what it was before I stepped blindly inside. If you're still watching and the story is striking a chord, drop number 2 in the comments so I know you're following closely. Let's continue. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded neatly inside a heavy envelope that didn't match the bills and grocery flyers it was delivered with. My name was written in neat cursive across the front, but it was a hand I didn't recognize. I carried it back into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table before opening it. For some reason, I already knew who it was from before I tore the flap. Inside, a gold-embossed card gleamed under the light. It read, "Green Family Christmas, hosted by Daniel and Rebecca Green." The address printed in bold letters belonged to a large house in Lake Oswego, the kind of suburb where gates keep out strangers and lawns are trimmed to perfection. A quiet laugh escaped me, though it didn't feel humorous. 30 years of silence, and now I was invited not to a family dinner, but to a family event. Something about the formality of the invitation felt less like reconciliation and more like theater. I laid the card flat on the table and stared at it for a long while. My son, who had once stormed out of my shop swearing he'd never come back, was suddenly playing host in a neighborhood of doctors and lawyers. The words on the card were warm, but the presentation was cold. A performance, a showcase. Later that evening, I couldn't shake the thought. Against my better judgment, I sat down at my old computer and typed Daniel Green Portland into the search bar. The screen filled with results. His name appeared in local business journals, each headline carrying a different tone. Some praised his rise as a financial consultant, highlighting how he built a portfolio of high-end clients. Others whispered of questionable deals, investors who weren't happy, lawsuits that had been quietly settled. I clicked link after link, each article raising the hairs on my arms a little more. There was no direct scandal, no single line that condemned him outright. But the patterns were familiar to me. I'd seen the way men bend numbers and twist promises back in my own business days. There was smoke curling from the corners of Daniel's success, and I couldn't help but wonder how long until it became fire. My heart sank at the thought. Was that why he wanted me there? Not for Christmas, not for peace, but because he needed something? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, just as I was pulling on my boots to shovel the walkway, a knock rattled my front door. When I opened it, a man in a tailored wool coat stood on my steps. His smile was polished, his shoes spotless despite the snow, and in his hand was a sleek leather folder. He introduced himself politely, handing me a card with his name embossed in silver. "I work with your son, Mr. Green," he said. "Daniel speaks highly of you." I knew a salesman's tone when I heard it. He didn't come to exchange pleasantries. Within a minute, he was talking about opportunities to grow family wealth and how legacy investments could ensure security for generations. He spoke smoothly, but his eyes flickered around my modest home, pausing at the rusting pickup in the driveway and the peeling paint on the porch. I could feel him calculating me, measuring whether I fit the picture Daniel had painted. "I'm not interested," I said flatly, though my chest tightened. His smile didn't falter. He tucked the card back into my hand and added, "Your son is eager to see you again." We all are. Then he turned, walking down the steps with the confidence of someone who already thought he'd won. I closed the door slowly, staring at the folder he had left behind. It contained charts, projections, glossy photos of luxury developments, and promises of high returns. I didn't need to read them to understand. This wasn't about Christmas. Daniel knew about the money. That was the real invitation. The realization hit hard. 30 years of silence, 30 years of being forgotten, and suddenly I was useful again, not as a father, but as a wallet. My stomach churned, my hands shaking, as I folded the folder shut and shoved it deep into the bottom drawer of my desk. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, the gold invitation still on the table, and felt like I had been pulled into a game I hadn't agreed to play. It was no longer a question of whether to go to Christmas. The real question was how to walk into that house prepared, not just as a father looking for peace, but as a man who had something his son wanted and would no doubt try to take. The first move had been made, and the board was set. If you're still here and this twist is keeping you hooked, type number 3 below so I know you're with me. Let's keep going. The gold embossed invitation stayed tucked in my desk drawer, but I could feel it there every time I walked past. It was as if the card gave off its own kind of hum, pulling my thoughts back to the same question over and over. Should I go? I tried to convince myself that I would ignore it, that no good could come from stepping into a house where appearances mattered more than truth. Still, the silence of my home made the temptation louder. Every night, lying awake, I pictured Daniel, older now, gray, likely touching his temples, but still my son. I wondered what tone his voice would carry if we were face to face. Would it be sharp, like the last time I saw him, or would it be softened by years I had missed? One morning, restless and unable to stand the pull of uncertainty, I picked up the invitation again. On the back, in small type, was a phone number. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. A woman answered, her tone smooth, rehearsed. "Green residence," she said. When I asked for Daniel, there was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you the answer before the words come. "Mr. Green isn't available at the moment," she replied, "but he'll be delighted to see you at Christmas." Her politeness cut deeper than rudeness ever could. She spoke like I was a formality, something already filed away. I hung up and sat there with the receiver still buzzing in my hand, feeling smaller than I had in years. That weekend, I made my next attempt. I drove out toward Lake Oswego, the truck rattling louder as the houses grew larger. The streets curved smoothly, lined with manicured hedges and stone walls that seemed designed to keep people like me on the outside. When I finally turned down the street printed on the card, I slowed the truck. The greenhouse stood tall and deliberate, framed by iron gates that looked more like declarations than barriers. The lawn was perfect, not a blade of grass out of place. I didn't stop. I didn't press the intercom at the gate. I just sat there a moment, staring at the windows, wondering if Daniel was inside, and then I drove on. The old truck groaned as if it knew it didn't belong in that neighborhood. But my silence didn't last long. 2 days later, another knock came at my door. I hesitated before answering, half expecting Daniel himself. Instead, it was a woman in a sharp coat, her smile practiced, her arms full of brochures. She introduced herself as a representative from Green Capital and spoke quickly about legacy funds and family investment opportunities. I could feel my jaw tightening as I listened. This wasn't a family reaching out. This was business disguised as connection. I cut her off before she could finish. "Tell Daniel," I said, my voice steady though my hands shook at my sides. "If he wants to see me, he knows where I live." Her lips pulled into a thin smile, the kind that carried both pity and dismissal. "I'll let him know," she said before turning down my walkway. I watched her heels crunch against the salted steps, the cold air swallowing her perfume before the wind carried it away. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the same invitation. I realized something that should have been obvious. Every attempt I made to bridge the gap only widened it. Every call, every drive, every knock on my door wasn't about me as a father. It was about the money. Daniel didn't need a family gathering. He needed leverage, and I was just another piece on his board. The thought landed heavy in my chest. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the furnace hum, the house creaking in its old bones. 30 years ago, I lost my son to pride and ambition. Now, it seemed he wanted me back for the very same reasons. I knew then that whatever awaited me at Christmas, it would not be reconciliation. It would be a test, and I would have to decide whether to walk into it prepared as a father or armored as a man who had learned, too late, what his silence was worth. If you're still watching and this journey resonates with you, comment number 4 below so I know you're not leaving. Let's continue together. Christmas Eve carried with it a silence that was more suffocating than peaceful. Snow had fallen the night before, powdering Portland in a clean white coat that pretended the world was simple. I pulled on my old wool coat, the one that had served me at weddings, funerals, and winters too long to count, and set out in my truck. The engine coughed, like it didn't believe I had the courage to make the trip. The streets of Lake Oswego looked like a painting, each mansion lit up with strings of lights wound tightly around gates and trees. Every house seemed determined to outshine the last, each one flaunting its perfection. When I finally reached the green residence, I felt like an intruder before I even parked. Cars worth more than my home lined the drive, sleek machines catching the glow of the lanterns. My truck sat among them like a misplaced relic. The iron gates were wide open, a gesture that was supposed to say welcome, but instead reminded me I wasn't part of this world anymore. I walked up slowly, boots crunching the snow too loudly for comfort. The door opened before I could knock. Rebecca stood there in a satin dress, her hair styled so neatly it looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her smile was polite, but there was no warmth in it. "Stanley," she said evenly, "Daniel will be glad you came." The words were shaped like hospitality, but the tone was carved out of ice. Inside, the house buzzed with chatter and laughter. People stood in clusters, glasses of wine raised, their words tumbling over each other with easy confidence. I caught snippets about stock markets, resorts, and vacation homes. I felt eyes slide over me as I stepped through the hall. Quick appraisals, a mix of curiosity and judgment. The warmth of the room only deepened my sense of being out of place. Then Daniel appeared, smiling with that same careful precision I had seen years ago when he was younger, and trying to charm teachers into forgiving late assignments. His arm was wrapped around a man in a tailored suit, someone who looked every bit the business partner. Daniel's smile widened as he spotted me. "Dad," he said. The word sounded like it had been rehearsed, as if he'd tried it on a dozen times in front of a mirror. He came forward, gave me a quick handshake, and turned to his guest. "This is my father, a man who understands the value of building something lasting." The man shook my hand, firm and practiced. Another followed, and another, each of them dressed like wealth was a uniform. Their questions were careful at first, then sharper, probing. They asked about resources, legacy, long-term investments. The politeness was thinly veiled ambition. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice how the introduction stripped me of identity. I wasn't Daniel's father, I was a potential investor. Dinner should have been a reprieve, but it only made the charade louder. The dining room was dressed to impress, crystal glasses, silverware that gleamed like it had never been used, a table long enough to hold a small army. Conversation rolled easily at first, talk of vacations and charitable donations. But the wine loosened tongues, and one of Daniel's associates leaned across the table. His voice was smooth but direct. "Mr. Green, we've heard you've done well for yourself recently. Are you open to expanding your portfolio?" The words silenced everything inside me. My fork hovered in midair. Rebecca's posture stiffened. Daniel gave me a quick glance, a mixture of warning and demand. His eyes said everything his lips didn't. "Play along, don't embarrass me." For a moment, the years between us folded back, and I saw the boy who had once stormed out of my shop, slamming the door behind him, shouting that I was holding him back. I set my glass down carefully, letting the stem ring against the polished wood. "I came here for family," I said slowly, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the room's chatter. "If this is about money, then I'll take my leave." Silence spread, stretching across the table like a cold wind. Knives and forks paused mid-motion. The chandeliers seemed too bright, spotlighting the tension I had unleashed. Daniel's jaw tightened, his smile freezing into something brittle. He looked at me with eyes that begged and burned at the same time, but I didn't flinch. The truth had finally surfaced. For decades, our distance had been built on pride, silence, and ambition. Tonight, in this glittering room filled with people who cared more about returns than relationships, it became clear. I hadn't been invited as a father. I'd been invited as a prize. The study was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the ticking of a brass clock breaking the air. Daniel stood across from me, his hands buried in the pockets of his tailored trousers, his jaw tight as stone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One word could tip us both over. "Why did you come?" he asked finally, his voice sharp but trembling underneath. "If you weren't going to play along, why bother showing up at all?" His eyes burned, not with anger alone, but with a fear he was trying desperately to hide. I leaned against the edge of the desk, keeping my gaze steady. "I came because you asked me. I thought maybe after 30 years, you wanted me back as your father, not as a bank account." My words landed heavy, and I could see him flinch, just barely, like a boy caught in a lie. He turned away from me, pacing the length of the rug, his polished shoes sinking into the fibers. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I've built something here. I have responsibilities. People rely on me." His words sped up, as though he could convince himself if he said them quickly enough. "What you've built," I said calmly, "is a house on sand. It looks solid, but the tide always comes in. And when it does, you'll realize you've been standing on nothing." Daniel stopped pacing and spun to face me, his face red now, his voice breaking through the veneer of control. "You think I wanted to invite you?" Rebecca insisted. "She said it would make me look grounded, that investors would trust me more if they saw family at the table." He paused, his chest heaving, then added, almost in a whisper, "And maybe I thought you'd finally give me what you never did. Approval." The confession struck harder than his anger. I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to wait for me to look up from my work, to nod at his drawings, to say something kind when he made a good catch at Little League. Somewhere along the way, I had failed him too. That truth didn't excuse what he'd become, but it made the weight in my chest heavier. I took a step toward him. "Approval doesn't come with a check, Daniel. It comes when a man can stand on his own and be honest about what he's done." His eyes darted away, and I knew he was thinking about the lawsuits, the debts, the cracks in the empire he had so carefully polished. Pride kept him silent, but the truth was already leaking out through the slump of his shoulders. I had a choice in that moment. I could walk out, leave him to fall apart under the weight of his own ambition, or I could plant something firmer in front of him. A chance, not a bailout, but a path. "I won't give you money," I said firmly. "But I'll give you one thing, the truth. You've been lying to yourself so long you don't know what's real anymore. If you want to fix what's broken, you'll need to stop chasing appearances and start doing the work. Hard, unglamorous work. The kind that doesn't get you applause at a table like this." For a long time, Daniel didn't answer. His breathing slowed, his jaw relaxed, and he stared at the floor as if the pattern in the rug might give him a way out. Then, quietly, he said, "If I do that, I lose everything." I shook my head. "No, you lose what was never yours to keep." The words settled between us. They weren't what he wanted to hear, but they were what he needed. He closed his eyes briefly, as if shutting out the world, then opened them again with something different in his gaze. Not surrender, not yet, but the beginning of recognition. The brass clock ticked on. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel like punishment. It felt like choice ... If you're still watching and can feel the tension rising, write number 6 in the comments to let me know you're with me. Let's see what happens next. The morning after Christmas arrived with a sky the color of dull metal, gray and unforgiving. I woke before dawn, restless, the echoes of last night's confrontations still rattling in my chest. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like judgment. I shuffled into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and stared out the window at the thin crust of snow covering the yard. For a moment, I tried to imagine life as it had been before the invitation, before the dinner table where my son's ambition had been laid bare, but the truth clung to me like frost. Nothing could go back to the way it was. The first phone call came before I'd even poured my cup. It was Frank, an old colleague from my years at the mill. His voice carried the uneasy tone of someone who didn't know whether to comfort or condemn. "Stanley," he said, "you've seen the papers?" I told him no. He didn't hesitate to read the headline aloud. "Green development facing investor scrutiny." My hand tightened around the receiver until my knuckles ached. Frank paused, waiting for me to respond, but I had nothing to offer him. "It doesn't look good," he added softly. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat at the table with the newspaper folded on the front porch, waiting for me like an accusation. The print was bold, merciless. Daniel's name was there in black ink, not buried halfway down the column, but right at the top. Allegations of misused funds, stalled projects, investors demanding explanations. It was all spelled out for anyone with 50 cents to spare. By mid-morning, the phone was relentless. A cousin from Nebraska asked if I had heard. A neighbor called to say she was praying for us, though her tone carried more curiosity than faith. Even Rebecca's brother left a terse message on the answering machine, as if I held some secret key to making sense of Daniel's mess. Each call chipped away at what little calm I had left, until it felt as if the whole town knew more about my son's failures than I did. I decided to drive into town, needing to move, needing air that didn't feel so suffocating. But there was no escape there, either. At the diner, two men lowered their newspapers quickly when I walked in, their eyes darting to the counter, as though silence would disguise their whispers. At the hardware store, a young clerk asked in a careful voice if I was related to the man in the paper. I lied and said I was just a distant relative. The boy nodded, relieved, and went back to stacking shelves. By the time I returned home, the weight of Daniel's choices had settled heavy in my bones. I sat in the truck long after turning off the ignition, gripping the steering wheel as though it might steady me. My son had built a kingdom on sand, and now the tide was rolling in. That evening, just as the last light slipped behind the hills, the phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice was different. No polish, no calculated charm, just ragged breaths and the edge of panic. "Dad," he said, "they're coming after me. The investors, the papers, everyone's pulling out. I don't know how long I can hold this together." For a moment I didn't speak. I listened to the sound of his breathing, fast and shallow, like a man cornered. I thought of the boy he used to be, running home with scraped knees, calling out for help when he still believed I could fix everything. Now, 30 years later, the fear in his voice was the same, only heavier, sharper with age. "You knew this day would come," I said finally, my tone even. "You can't build a life on appearances and expect it to last." There was a pause, then the sound of him swallowing hard. I thought I could manage it. I thought if I looked strong enough, no one would question me." His words cracked at the edges, the armor he had worn for decades beginning to fall apart. I closed my eyes, letting out a long breath. "Strength isn't about pretending, Daniel. It's about standing when the ground shakes. And right now, you have to decide whether you're going to stand or let it all bury you." Silence followed, but not the angry kind we had shared for years. This was a silence full of realization, heavy and unsteady. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can." I wanted to tell him he could, that he was still my son, that there was still time to turn the tide, but the truth was harsher, and it pressed against my tongue until I could taste it. "Then you'd better learn," I said, "because no one else can do it for you." The line went quiet. A faint click followed, and the house returned to its silence. I sat there in the dim kitchen light, staring at the receiver in my hand, and realized the storm had only just begun. The storm around Daniel had reached a fever pitch. Each morning, I would pick up the paper from the porch, and there he was again, front page, headlines dripping with scandal, his face frozen in photographs where his smile looked more like a grimace. The man who once believed appearances could shield him now had no shield left. The town buzzed with it. At the grocery store, people spoke his name in hushed tones. At church, his absence was noticed as loudly as if he had stood up mid-sermon and walked out. For a while, I chose silence. I had learned long ago that words thrown too quickly can feel like weapons. Better to let him sit in the rubble of what he'd built, to let him feel the full weight of collapse. But silence has its limits, and late one night, as snow pressed against my windows and the furnace hummed a steady rhythm, the phone rang. "Dad," Daniel said, and his voice wasn't frantic this time. It was something worse, hollow. A man scraped clean of excuses. "What do I do now?" It was not a demand, nor a plea for a bailout. It was the question of a son who had finally run out of masks. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam from my mug, and let the moment hold us both. "You tell the truth," I said finally. "You admit what you did. You stop running and you start again. Not as the man you wanted the world to believe you were, but as the man you can still choose to be." There was silence on the line, heavy but not angry. He didn't argue. He didn't scoff. He just breathed, and for the first time in 30 years, it felt like he had actually heard me. The next day, we met at a cafe on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where no one wore suits, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed strong enough to carry a man through winter. Daniel arrived late, not in his usual polished armor, but in a plain coat that looked borrowed, his hair messy, his eyes red-rimmed from too many sleepless nights. He slid into the booth across from me without pretense. No performance, no forced smile, just a man stripped bare. I studied him for a moment, the way a father studies his son when he is both familiar and foreign. Then I spoke. "You can't rebuild the empire," I said, "but you can rebuild yourself. Start with the people you hurt. Admit what you did. Don't hide behind lawyers. Don't hide behind timing or excuses. Lay it all out. If you want to survive this, you have to be transparent." He kept his eyes down, tracing the cracks in the tabletop with his finger. "And after that?" he asked quietly. "After that," I said, "you work. Honest work. The kind that doesn't get you headlines. The kind that pays bills, one check at a time. It won't look like the life you dreamed of, but it will be real. And real lasts longer than dreams." He looked up then, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the shadow of humility. "You think people will forgive me?" he asked. I shook my head. "Don't aim for forgiveness. Aim for restitution. Do right by them, and let time do the rest." We sat in that booth a long time, the snow piling higher outside the window. For once, he didn't fill the space with empty promises. He didn't declare that he'd fix everything overnight. He just listened, and that, in itself, was a start. When the waitress came by to refill our cups, Daniel surprised me by pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket and paying for the coffee. It was such a small act, but in that moment, it meant more than the lavish dinners he had once thrown. He was beginning, in the smallest way, to take responsibility. As we stood to leave, he hesitated, then asked, "Will you be there? If I try?" I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight he carried, and the boy he once was beneath it. "I'll be there," I said, "but you'll have to walk the road yourself." He nodded, and for the first time in decades, we stepped out into the snow, not as strangers, not quite as father and son, but as two men who had finally decided to stop lying to themselves. If you're still watching and the emotions are hitting deep, comment number 8 below so I know you're right here with me. Let's move forward. The weeks after Christmas stretched long and heavy, like the quiet hours between snowstorms. Out in town, Daniel's name was still on everyone's lips, though the tone had shifted. At first, the headlines screamed scandal, each article clawing deeper into the ruins of green development. But as the days passed, the noise softened into something more patient, almost clinical. Updates on hearings, notices of account freezes, the slow churn of a system taking its time. His empire was gone, replaced by paperwork, debt, and a trail of people waiting to see if he would finally stand still long enough to face them. For Daniel, the collapse stripped him bare. He had no more stage to stand on, no more spotlight to hide beneath. And in that strange quiet, I began to see a different man. Not the polished executive with rehearsed charm, not the boy who once turned his back on me, but someone caught between shame and resolve, trying to decide which one would claim him. He started showing up at the cafe downtown, no longer in tailored suits, but in work clothes that seemed borrowed from a humbler life. He sat across from investors who agreed to meet, not with elaborate excuses, but with words that carried an unfamiliar weight of honesty. Sometimes he stammered, sometimes he faltered, but he didn't walk away. And slowly, a handful of small checks began to move out of his account. They weren't enough to erase the damage, but they were proof of something he had never offered before: restitution. I would sit by the window of that cafe some mornings, sipping my coffee while he spoke to men and women who once trusted him. I didn't interrupt, didn't hover. I just watched, noting the way his posture changed. His shoulders, once squared in arrogance, now carried their weight differently, lower, steadier, as though he was learning to bear something real. Back at home, the phone continued to ring. Neighbors asked if the stories were true. Relatives called to share their sympathy or their judgment, but I stopped answering every call. The truth no longer needed my defense. Daniel's life, his actions, and his choices had built this storm, and it wasn't my job to carry it on my back. Instead, I learned to let the phone go silent and turn my attention to the smaller moments that mattered. There were knocks at my door that winter that meant more than any headline. One afternoon, Ava showed up with a drawing folded carefully in her mittened hands. It was of a tree in the snow, branches heavy, a square window glowing warm beneath it. She handed it to me without words, and I stuck it on my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like Nebraska. That drawing, more than any article, reminded me of what still stood unbroken. On weekends, I watched Daniel's children run through the thin snow in the courtyard of their modest townhouse, their laughter sharp against the cold air. Jake, bundled in a coat too big for him, declared himself quarterback of the sidewalk, while Ava built forts with chalk lines when the ground wasn't frozen solid. Maddie, for all her reservations, sent muffins now and then. She didn't linger, didn't offer speeches, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. Even small acts of civility became signs of something slowly mending. The most striking change, though, was Daniel himself. He began working at the lumberyard, just as I'd nudged him toward. The first morning, Luis, the foreman, sent me a text. He showed up. Not fast, but steady. I'll take steady. That became the rhythm of Daniel's days. Hard hats, early mornings, sore muscles, and wages earned without pretense. He grumbled at first, embarrassed by the humility of it, but he kept showing up. And showing up, I learned, is more powerful than speeches. At night, I would hear the lumber truck's horn echo faintly through town, signaling the end of his shift. Some evenings he'd stop by, still in his boots, shoulders dusted with sawdust. He didn't always have much to say, but sometimes silence is the language that heals better than apologies. When he did speak, it was never about rebuilding his company or restoring his image. It was about ordinary things. How heavy a stack of 2x4s really was, how Luis swore by donuts on Fridays, how Jake insisted the lumberyard smelled like giant pencils. For me, the shift was quieter, but just as real. I no longer carried the ache of unanswered questions about why my son had turned away from me 30 years ago. That chapter had already been written and couldn't be undone. Instead, I chose to focus on what the present offered. A man, flawed and wounded, finally doing the work he had avoided his entire life. My house, once heavy with solitude, felt lighter. It was not filled with grand reconciliations or dramatic apologies. It was filled with smaller truths. A granddaughter's drawing on the fridge, a knock on the door with muffins in hand, a son's tired voice on the phone saying, simply, "I'm on my way home." I realized then that endings don't always roar. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like snow settling on rooftops, covering what's broken without erasing it. The father I had once tried too hard to be, the provider, the savior, the man who solved everything, was gone. In his place was someone simpler, a man willing to sit in silence, to let truth carry its own weight, to let the next generation find their footing without forcing them into a story they weren't ready to live. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't tragedy either. It was something harder to name but easier to bear, a kind of peace that doesn't come from winning or losing, but from choosing to stop fighting battles that no longer need a victor. And in that quiet, as the weeks rolled on, I found myself breathing easier. Not because Daniel had redeemed himself completely, but because for the first time in decades, he was at least trying. And sometimes, trying is enough to let a man sleep at night. Winter had a way of holding on in our part of the country. By March, the trees were still bare, their branches rattling against the wind like old bones. Snow clung stubbornly to shaded corners of sidewalks, dirty and grainy, long past the time when it was welcome. The season reflected what had passed between Daniel and me. long, cold, drawn out, but also, beneath it all, something stirring, waiting for thaw. By then, the noise had softened. Reporters had moved it on to fresher scandals, and Daniel's face no longer appeared in the headlines every morning. The lawsuits hadn't disappeared, but they had settled into the slow rhythm of bureaucracy. Paperwork shuffled between offices and signatures gathered like reluctant blessings. His empire, green development, was no longer spoken of in terms of innovation or ambition. Instead, it lived only in records and memories, the kind neighbors whispered about briefly before changing the subject. Daniel himself was quieter too. He wasn't the polished figure who once strode into rooms expecting applause. He was a man in plain work clothes, carrying calluses he'd never known before. He clocked hours at a lumberyard, of all places, moving timber and learning to follow orders instead of giving them. The pay was modest, the work unglamorous, but it was honest. He came home tired, not from schemes, but from labor. And that tiredness, I began to believe, might just be his salvation. The children adapted faster than either of us expected. Ava drew chalk pictures on the walkway of the townhouse they now lived in, creating bright trees and crooked letters that seemed to insist on joy even in the cold. Jake learned how to shovel snow for pocket money, coming home with red cheeks and a grin that had nothing to do with wealth, and everything to do with pride. For all that Daniel and Maddie had lost, the children found pieces of a life worth living, smaller, humbler, but steady. As for me, I found myself standing at my own window more often, a chipped mug in hand, watching the maple outside sway against the wind. For years I had lived with the ache of a son who wouldn't speak to me, carrying that silence like a stone in my chest. Now, I found myself learning something new, how to accept his voice when it came, unpolished and unsure, but real. We spoke more often, though never about the old wounds directly. We talked about work, the weather, the price of groceries, small things, but steady things. And in those conversations, I found a peace I hadn't expected. One night, as snow fell gently against the glass, Daniel came by with the children. They carried pizza boxes and laughter into my house, filling it in a way it hadn't felt in decades. Ava showed me her drawings, Jake asked if I had any old board games, and Daniel, awkward at first, helped wash the dishes after we ate. There were no speeches, no apologies dressed as performances, just the ordinary rhythms of family. For me, it was enough. It struck me then that the lesson of all this, the betrayal, the silence, the collapse, wasn't about wealth or even forgiveness. It was about boundaries, about learning where love ends and responsibility begins. For years, I had confused the two, thinking that to love my son meant to save him, to shield him from consequences. I had given him money, defended his choices, tried to keep him from falling, and in doing so, I had only taught him that I would always catch him. But when I stopped catching, when I finally let him fall, he had no choice but to learn how to stand. It was brutal, and it broke more than I care to admit, but it also gave him the chance to rebuild on his own feet, and it gave me the chance to stop being a savior and start being something simpler, a father who was present, steady, and honest. Neighbors still asked questions. Some wondered if I had been too harsh, letting him face the storm without stepping in. Others praised me for holding the line. I didn't bother defending myself to either side. They hadn't lived the 30 years of silence, the nights wondering if my son even remembered I existed. They hadn't felt the ache of handing out help, only to watch it turn into entitlement. I knew the truth, and the truth was enough. The truth was this: love isn't always soft. Sometimes it is steel, unbending, holding firm when everything in you wants to give way. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give isn't another chance, but the space for a child to become someone who deserves one. That winter night, after Daniel and the kids left, I stood at the doorway, the sound of their laughter still lingering. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt used, lived in, ready for whatever came next. I set my mug on the counter and picked up the list I kept tucked beneath a magnet on the fridge. On it were the lines I'd written months before. Stop answering first. Trust the paper. Leave a door open for the children. Say peace out loud. Earned is greater than owed. I added one more line at the bottom. Love is not rescue. love is presence. Then I turned off the light, let the house settle into its familiar quiet, and carried that message with me into the dark. Life rarely unfolds in a straight line. More often it bends, stumbles, and doubles back, forcing us to confront truths we've long avoided. What begins as certainty can end in ruin, and what feels like ruin can quietly transform into the foundation of something more enduring. It is in those quiet shifts, the ones that do not make headlines or spark applause, that the deepest lessons hide. The human journey is not defined solely by victories or failures, but by the willingness to stand within both and allow them to shape us. There is a temptation in every heart to disguise weakness, to build a facade so polished that no one sees the cracks. Yet those cracks are where light seeps in, where growth takes root. To live honestly is to accept that mistakes are not the end of the story, but invitations to begin again, without illusion, without pretense. Peace, when it finally arrives, is rarely loud. It does not come wrapped in triumph or sealed by applause. It comes in the soft repetition of small, honest acts, the daily choice to do right when no one is watching, the humility to repair what can be repaired, and the courage to leave behind what cannot. In a world that rewards speed and spectacle, there is a radical strength in being steady, patient, and unremarkably faithful to one's word. We often imagine redemption as a single moment, a dramatic turning point when everything is made new. But real redemption is quieter than that. It is not found in speeches or grand gestures, but in the ordinary rhythm of a life rebuilt. Debts repaid slowly, trust earned gradually, dignity restored one step at a time. It is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of endurance that gives it weight. There is also a truth about love woven into these lessons. Love is not always about shielding others from pain or erasing the consequences of their actions. At its truest, love allows space for responsibility. It recognizes that growth cannot happen in the shadow of constant rescue. To love is to care deeply enough to let someone face the mirror, even when the reflection is hard to bear. And in turn, to love ourselves is to accept that boundaries are not walls, they are the conditions that allow peace to take root. In the quiet corners of life, where the noise of ambition and downfall fades, the essentials stand clear. Work that is honest, relationships that are steady, and choices that align with truth. These are the building blocks of a life that can withstand storms. When stripped of illusion, what remains is what always mattered: integrity, humility, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path is narrow. The world is full of second chances disguised as ordinary days. They do not announce themselves. They wait in silence, offering an opportunity to choose differently, to live with a little more honesty than before. And those who learn to see them, to pick up the pen again, to show up at dawn, to pay what is owed without excuse, discover that healing is not something granted from the outside, but something earned quietly within. In the end, the story is less about downfall or success than it is about transformation. It is about learning that peace is not a prize handed down by others, but a condition we cultivate by living in truth. It is about discovering that what is earned carries a weight that what is owed never can. And it is about realizing that the most powerful legacies are not written in wealth or reputation, but in the steady testimony of lives lived honestly, with hands that carry more than they promise, and hearts that have learned the strength of silence. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.